Hello and welcome to Ask an Author with Julia Kelly. I am very excited to be joined today by your New York Times and USA Today best-selling author of many books, and I am a big fan as well, Lauren Willig. Welcome.
Thank you so much for having me. I'm so delighted to be here.
I have been a fan of yours for a very long time. I've read quite a few of your books, and I was delighted to read Band of Sisters, which is the book that we're going to be talking about mostly about today, because it felt very fresh and very new to me. We're sort of in a different story than I've seen told a lot recently. So perhaps you could tell us a little bit about what readers can find when they pick this book up.
Sure. Well, Band of Sisters is based on the true story of the Smith College Relief Unit, who were a group of intrepid and determined Smith College alumni who went overseas at the height of World War I to rebuild villages that had been devastated by the German army. Of course, the wrinkle in this was that the war was still going on. This was 1917. They were 9 miles from the front, and so they were bringing milk to children and trying to rebuild schoolhouses and get village life up and running while the shells were falling around them and the Germans were threatening to invade.
It's a really fascinating story because they are doing, as you say, that relief work. So their focus is rather than, I've seen a lot of stories about nurses giving relief to wounded soldiers, which are really interesting stories of themselves. But this is much more about the women and the people on the ground, the people who are affected by just simply living in this area of France, right?
Well, what had happened was, of course, the Germans invaded France in World War I as well as World War II. It was like their practice run.
Yeah.
But in the spring of 1917, the French and the Brits managed to push those lines back a bit and free up some of the territory that had been previously occupied by the Germans. But before they retreated, the Germans systematically destroyed all the villages they'd been occupying. They took the remaining villagers who were, the old, the infirm, the very young babies, and shuttled them off to wait in one village while they went back and poisoned the wells. They broke the plows. They destroyed anything capable of providing shelter.
Mhm.
You name it, they wrecked it. And then they went back and said to the villagers, okay, you can go home now. And their idea was that the villagers would be a burden on the French war effort, that there'd be these starving, dying people the French government would have to deal with. It would distract them. But what they hadn't reckoned with was one Smith College alumna, a woman named Harriet Boyd Hawes, who was a groundbreaking archaeologist, actually, for anyone who loves Elizabeth Peters' Amelia Peabody books. She was basically an American Amelia Peabody, but she also was a humanitarian and a periodic war nurse. And she heard about this and was like, okay, someone has to deal with it. And clearly the people to deal with it are American college women. And her plan was that you get a group of bright, well-educated women there in the war zone and have them turn their hand to whatever needs doing. Because, at this point, it's 1917. No one has any idea when the war is going to end. I mean, no one believed the war would ever have gone on that long. It's been 3 years at this point, and there is no end in sight. And these people are starving now. And, it's summer, but it's going to be winter soon. And without shelter and food, all of these people, thousands of villagers will die. And so she gets a group of Smithies, 18 alumni, out there within 3 months to set about trying to rebuild these villages and restore people's lives before winter sets in. I mean, it's an incredibly ambitious undertaking.
Mhm. It's amazing because nobody seems to really know what to do with them, not just because they're American women who come in, but because nobody's really doing relief work in this focused way. It feels like the American Red Cross is serving, or the Red Cross in general is serving a different role in the war. And they're going in, they're focused very specifically on this one area and these sort of 2,000, is it right, villagers that they are supporting, whether they're young people or, the elderly as well, who can't necessarily fend for themselves in the way that they used to because all their resources have been taken away from them.
Right. I mean, what they're trying to do is give them what they need to help themselves. I mean, the interesting thing is that this did not come out of whole cloth. There are actually other relief missions in the Somme at the time, but none of them are quite as hands-on. So Anne Morgan, J.P. Morgan's daughter, was headquartered not far from the Smithies at Blerincourt. But there were a
Mm.
bunch of what I think of, and I realize this sounds very reductive, but as vanity projects, where you got heiresses who are like, I'm going to do something to help, but they're
Mhm.
doing it a very different way. So the Smith College Relief Unit was quartered on the grounds of a ruined chateau in these tiny little army barracks with no insulation in the back. And they went to go visit Anne Morgan at her chateau, and they came back and they were like, oh my God, she's got wallpaper and
Right.
china, and her chateau has a roof.
There are rugs on the floor.
It's a very different. And so Anne Morgan was also doing reconstruction work. Helen Clay Frick at one point came over and was, Frick's daughter. And so there were other people out there, but none of them were quite as hands-on living with the villagers, sharing the same conditions as the villagers in the way the Smith College Relief Unit was. And they took their model from a movement called the Settlement House Movement, which I don't think many people have heard about now, but the idea was this was sort of, think the early junior league. This was at the turn of the century when you had upper middle class women who needed a direction for their energies, an era where most women of that class don't take jobs. And what many did was they went into distressed urban areas, and goodness only knows there were plenty of distressed urban areas in America at the time. And they taught classes for children. They provided hygiene classes for young mothers, all of this sort of relief work. Mm-hmm. And so for many of these women, the women of the Smith College Relief Unit, they had backgrounds in that kind of urban relief work, at which they then sort of tried to apply to these rural French villages, sometimes with more success than others, where it was like, oh my God, this is not actually the same as working in a slum in New York. There are cows.
Yeah, very different challenges in some respects, but there's also a human aspect that I think really shines through in your character. Emmy, is that the right? Yes, Emmeline. And she has this sort of wonderful way about her and this wonderful way of working with people. And you can see that because she has that settlement experience from her relief work that she did back in New York, right?
Yes, exactly. I wanted to give so Emmy is one of my two heroines. I have one is a scholarship student who is there somewhat reluctantly, and the other is a Knickerbocker Mayflower debutante, but who is dedicated heart and soul to this sort of relief work. And I wanted to sort of give a nod to the settlement house background that so many of the real members of the Smith College Relief Unit have, the fact that they weren't going in entirely inexperienced, that there were many things that were new or shocking to them. Mm-hmm. And I mean, goodness only knows the experience of entering a war zone where things have been deliberately destroyed, where people's lives have been deliberately destroyed, is something that no one could possibly have experienced before that. But they were not, they were in their own way women of the world.
Yeah, they're fascinating because, I think, well, first of all, you open the book with a dedication to the women that this story is based around. And you have a wonderful author's note going into the history of not only how you sort of came up with the idea to write this book, but also the actual women who are there. But one of the things I thought was really interesting was that specifically that they're American college women during a time when I think a lot of us, sort of the casual layperson in the modern era, doesn't necessarily associate the turn of the I'm going to say this correctly, the turn of the 20th century with strongly with sort of, the modern woman, even though we know that is starting to emerge and kind of different ideas of what womanhood looks like. What is it that makes them unique in sort of the time and place that they're in? What makes them unique in terms of the skills that they bring?
Well, one of the things that struck me so strongly researching this book was how many of them were professional women. The head of the unit was an archaeologist, a groundbreaking, very famous archaeologist. The unit's assistant director was a doctor who, was a fairly senior doctor at that point. They had an agriculturalist, a woman who was there to deal with the chickens and cows and so on, but who was delayed because she had a job at the Department of Agriculture in DC that she couldn't leave. And that struck me even more than the doctor and the archaeologist, that, here was this woman, a Smith grad from, I'm trying to remember what class year the real woman was. It was like class of 1906 or something like that. Mm-hmm. But who had a job in the government working with agriculture, and no one thinks that's weird. Because I think we have an idea of what women did and what women were that is heavily shaped on what happened later, on the 1950s, when in fact this generation is a generation that sees doors opening to women all over. And in fact, when they go over to France, the vote is under vote in many states. And there's one of the, I sort of wallowed in their letters home. And one of the letters I particularly loved was one of the women wrote home saying, hurrah for suffrage, because the vote had just passed for women in New York. And she wrote home that all the New Yorkers were celebrating and crowing it over all the girls from other states, except the Californians who also had the vote. And so it's like there's this sense of boundless optimism that women can do anything and that this is finally beginning to be recognized. There really isn't that sense of limitation that one might have expected. I think, we see their long skirts and we think of them as more curtailed than they actually were.
Mhm.
And actually, an explicit part of the mission was not just to help the French villagers, although clearly that was the core of it, but their founder was also very explicit about the fact that their going over there was also to show the world what the American college woman could do, and that women were equal to anything. And oh boy, did they do that. And it was actually because of their success, several other college relief units were founded and sponsored and sent over. And so they really did trailblaze and really show the world what American women could do.
So I'm so glad you mentioned that, because one of the things that somebody left a comment before we started this, Sydney said, "I just finished this awesome story yesterday. I wish I could be there for the live today, but I have to work." So she'll be watching it on later tonight. But she said, "I kept envisioning this tiny little being that Kate is, who's your other heroine, and what determination and drive she has that makes her 5'1" frame stand 6 feet tall." And I think that's one of the things that really comes through with this book, is how determined these women are, and how, as you said, nobody really knew what to expect when they went into this, but they figured out a way to make this work. And there's something so refreshing and so modern about that in a lot of ways. And I think Kate is a really good example of that, including one of my favorite parts of the book, which is when they show up expecting their trucks to have arrived, and their trucks came in packing boxes. So they had to put their trucks together. And sort of from the get-go, they experience these difficulties, but they figure out a way to make it through because they do have this determination.
Well, and that was again, one of the comments by one of the real women in her letters was that nothing here ever happens the way you expect it to, but there's never a dull moment, because whatever they planned, whatever they did, something was going to come up and they had to deal with it and pivot on the spot. And it's funny because when I was reading through their letters and the documents they left behind, trying to get a handle on what this unit really was and what they were there to do, there were times where I was frustrated by the vagueness of their founders' plans, because it was like, we'll just go over and do all the things. It's like, but what are all the things? How are you planning to do this? And I realized that in many ways, that very vagueness was intentional and was part of the plan, because they didn't know what was going to hit them at any moment. And so really the core of her whole idea was that they had to be ready to deal with almost anything. And that's pretty much what wound up happening. And of course, the craziest thing they wind up dealing with is a German invasion. And to me, that was, reading the real story and then also writing it in my own fictionalized version. That's the moment where you really see all the skills they've learned and all the flexibility they've acquired come into play. Because, of course, no one can be perfect. No one expects a German invasion. I mean, even though they've been warned about it for weeks, but it had become a joke. People kept being like, the big push is coming. And they're like, yeah, you told that to us last week. Haha, the Germans are going to invade this week. And then when the Germans actually do, they have to snap into action. And the way they do that is so impressive and so incredible, because they're used to at this point just reacting and taking whatever resources they have at their disposal and working together. And the craziest thing is, for those who have read the book, everything that happens as they respond to the invasion were things that the real Smith women actually did.
It was incredible reading in your author's note where you detail, where a lot of this comes from. And it comes from directly from their letters and from the records of what this unit did. And they are an amazing, amazing group of women. I have so many questions that I want to ask you, but perhaps kind of staying on the women and staying on character. Would you tell us a little bit more about Kate and sort of what sets her apart from the rest of this group of Smith alums that decide to go over?
Sure. I mean, Kate, who is really in many ways my primary heroine, she's different from the rest of the women in two ways. I mean, one is that she was a scholarship student. And this was an era when to go to college was it was a choice. It was a choice that made a statement, and it was not cheap. most American women did not go to college. And those who did go tended to be upper middle class lawyers' daughters. You tended not to have the debutantes for the most part didn't go because you didn't want to be a blue stocking.
Sure.
And if you were lower on the social scale, you didn't go, you couldn't afford it, you wouldn't even think of this as an option. But Kate is for anyone who's ever read Tree Grows in Brooklyn, basically Kate is my Francie. She's
Mhm.
Francie if Francie got a scholarship to Smith with some changes to her biography. But that was a lot of my inspiration for Kate. But so she feels herself different because so many of these other women, they have grown up, they take servants for granted. They come from households where you've always had at least a maid and probably a cook and a driver as well. And we're not talking about the super rich. We're just talking about sort of a level of upper middle class comfort and security that Kate, who is the daughter of an Irish and a Czech immigrant, has never known, and that sets her apart. Actually, brief digression, I was talking to the Smith Club of Minnesota the other night,
Hmm.
and one of the women told me her grandmother had been a scholarship student at Smith at just this era and had really felt that difference, that there was a lot of casual snobbery and she was really made to feel that she didn't belong.
Yeah.
So I paired Kate with the most unimpeachably socially perfect debutante I could, because in her own way, Emmy, my other heroine, is as far to one end of the spectrum as Kate is to the other. She is so socially secure, she doesn't have to care that Kate is a scholarship student. And that's in many ways what makes their friendship possible. But the other thing that shaped Kate was, so I stumbled on the Smith unit by accident by I stumbled on a memoir by a Smith alumna who had been a member of the original Smith College Relief Unit when I was researching something entirely different for another book. And when I sat down and read the memoir, one of the things that really struck me was the difference in tone when the author referred to the one Catholic member of the real
Mm.
Smith College Relief Unit. There was this definite us versus them tone, like, oh, those people. And when I read the private letters, not in all of them, but in a couple of people's letters, there was some really strong anti-Catholic sentiment that emerged. So Kate, in addition to being a scholarship student, she's Irish Catholic and also Bohemian Catholic. So she's sort of doubly immigrant Catholic, all of the things that were really looked down upon by the Protestant aristocracy of the time. And so I wanted to make her someone apart who really has to struggle with her social anxieties and her sense of whether she can fit into the group.
One of the things that I thought was so interesting with the different women, because there's a large unit, but you come to get to know a couple of them very, very well. And then a lot of them, you have a lot of detail about who these people are, and you spend time with them and you sort of understand, Maud has these, social snobberies, and, Alice is particularly good at this, and, has these different aspects of them. One of the things that was really interesting about Kate and Emmy was it was at different times in the novel, there are different moments where you think one is very much in the right or the other is very much in the right. And their relationship is kind of always shifting and changing. And you're putting it under a lot of stressors that are kind of very specifically, I imagine, designed to test one aspect of their friendship or another. And it's interesting because it's not just Kate that needs to grow. It's not just Emmy that needs to grow. It's, these two are kind of figuring out their friendship together. And I thought it was a really astute study of female friendship, because there are those imbalances that need to be worked out sometimes, especially if you come from very different backgrounds. It can become even more pronounced. But I think the thing that sort of unifies these two women as well as the entire group is that there is this idea of, we're here to do a job. We're here to do a job that not everybody wants us to be here to do. And that's another issue. They run into a lot of roadblocks and a lot of, skepticism. But it did seem like something that could kind of push them through and also get them to a point where they also have to address some of these things because it's affecting the rest of the unit and their ability to do their jobs as well. I thought it was a really interesting way of framing that social difference.
Well, there were two things I really wanted to explore there. And one is that, well, I went to an all-girls school for 13 years, so female friendship has always fascinated me. And in particular, the way we're drawn to people who we feel fulfill something we lack in ourselves.
Hmm.
That so often our friends are people who have something we feel we don't. And on the one hand, that satisfies a need. It's like puzzle pieces fitting together. But on the other hand, that often means that your best friend can also um, mine your worst insecurities, that they can also make you feel horrible about yourself because they do have the thing you lack. And with
Yeah.
Kate and Emmy, of course, Emmy has all this social standing and money and doesn't even realize, you know, she takes it so for granted, um, that, you know, that Kate herself as a scholarship student lacks. Whereas Kate is just, she's a brilliant student. Brilliant is the wrong word. She's a hard worker and a very
Yeah.
competent student. And poor Emmy, you know, graduates Smith by the skin of her teeth and envies Kate her ability to get things done. But of course, neither sees the strengths that the other sees in them. They only see their own weaknesses. And so the other thing I wanted to play with was what happens to relationships that are founded in a certain moment in time. You know, those college friendships where you were together 24/7 and you made sense together in that context. You worked in
Mhm.
that context. But what happens when you go out into the world and you've become different people, but you come back together? How does that old friendship fare? Can it stand up? Or have you developed too far apart in different ways? You know, I think we've all had those experiences where we have come back to people we knew at a certain point in our lives, and you have to struggle with the you were then versus the you are now, because it's very hard not to fall back into old patterns, but you're not that person anymore. It's a pair of shoes that pinches. And so how do you work that out? Or do you? Are there some friendships that are just not worth saving? And that's what Emmy and Kate struggle with while
Mhm.
they're trying to, you know, get these villages up and going with the German shells falling.
And then, of course, there's my favorite character named Julia, who is a very complicated character, but fascinating in her own right. And she's prickly and she can be difficult, but she, I think, is in a way is also fascinating because she's another example of, you know, you move on and you start to understand people in a different way, and a relationship can develop where really there you would have thought there was just scorched earth there. There's no possible way anything can grow from this original first impression. And I think it's fascinating to kind of, again, see that come to light because of the pressures of being, you know, together 24/7. I mean, these women are really working closely. It is a unit, even if they don't all get along, even if they don't all necessarily enjoy each other's company all the time. They're sort of forced to figure out a way to at least live with one another.
Well, I think in casual contact, we so often see people through the light of our own insecurities. And what a pressure cooker like that does is it strips away those outer layers and forces you to confront people as they are rather than as you would like them to be or as you think they are. And so that's what I was trying to do with these characters is force them to peel away the layers and actually see themselves and other people in a more honest light.
Yeah.
And some of it actually, again, like I feel like I was so spoiled with this book because I had thousands of pages of the real women's letters, and so much was just there in the letters waiting for me to just use it. And there were many people were very diplomatic, but there was one woman who wrote home about all of the internecine squabbles. I love this woman and I love her family for not editing her letters before they dropped them in the archive. Because some of there were some letter collections that had been edited before they were put in there, but
Sure.
mostly there were others that weren't. And her letters, like they cracked me up because she'd be like, well, so and so is rooming with so and so, and I kind of like them, but this girl's kind of annoying because of this. And you get the whole rundown on everyone in the group and how they related to each other, and you know who could work together and who didn't. And it gave such a wonderfully full picture of what it's like doing work like this, but with all these disparate personalities. You know, and some people had come with friends and some people had come by
Mhm.
themselves, and that all added to the dynamic as well.
Thank goodness for gossips, even, you know, dozens of years later.
Well, and I love too, she described people the way I used to describe people in my diary. But of course, she was writing to her best friend at home. So it was stuff like, so there was the girl in the purple hat was the one who fainted, you know, the one who knows Gilbert's brother. And it's, you know, these sort of everyone is connected in this web somehow. You're describing people by their clothes. I mean, it's basically, you know, the way I used to write in my diary or email my best friend, you know, home from college.
Sure, definitely. One of the things that also struck me, and I imagine some of this may have come from the letters, although I'd love to hear a bit more about the research part of this, was this is not all fun and games. This is not, you know, just a story about female friendship and, you know, the lovely moment of women coming together. There is some really hard stuff to read in this book. First of all, it's very muddy. The entire book is really covered in mud and dirt. And I really enjoyed, was it Florence who insisted that mud or dirt kept the warmth in, so nobody should be washing? But
actually, I stole that from their real agriculturalist, a woman named Frances Valentine, who wrote home that I'm much warmer when I don't wash. Really, dirt keeps the heat in. I'm thinking,
oh, no.
wow, your roommate must really love that.
Yeah, I think you'd have to be very tolerant in order to put up with that. But one of the things that I thought was fascinating was you did go into the grim realities of the fact that they were right there at the edge of a war zone, and people, as you know, you go into detail about the poisoned wells and the plows that were broken up, and the aftermath of the German occupation. And then there is an opportunity to go and to talk about bombings and to talk about the destruction that was left behind and the threat to some of these women from deserting soldiers, and also what happens if the Germans break the line. So there's a lot of, I think, reality and kind of grim realism that comes in. Was that mined from those letters, or was that additional research that you were doing?
Well, that was largely mined from those letters, because I was trying to hew as closely to their real experiences as they could. Every now and then they would minimize the threats to themselves. And so, of course, then the best example of that was, after they've been forced to retreat, they were working in a hospital in Beauvais, several retreats down the line, and the hospital they were working in got bombed. And in their letters home, they completely make light of this. They talk about the doctor singing while she works and all that, and how the French surgeon vowed, he would never leave. He will keep sewing up patients as long as there are patients to sew. There was another American nurse there the night of the bombing, and her account was so much more graphic and made it so much clearer how much danger they were all really in and how terrifying it was. And it made me go back and look at some of the things they were saying in their letters with more of a grain of salt, because there was that sort of jolly hockey sticks must minimize the danger kind of attitude, where they made a joke of everything. Again, this one woman who I adored, who wrote all the gossip about who was talking to whom, was also one of the very few people who wrote home how scared she was and how terrifying it was to hear the shells. And that sometimes she carried around this little silver flask and would take a nip of it, little silver flask of sherry, because sometimes when the shelling got really bad, it helped to have a sip of sherry. And, it was good to read that and hear that and get that perspective, because they were there in a war zone with all these horrors around them. One of the things that was strange, though, was that the war was with them and it wasn't at the same time, because even though they were only 9 miles from the front, they were really focused on rebuilding. So the war was going on around them, but their focus was positive. It was forward looking. They had to work as though they assumed that the Germans would never break through and that the work they were doing was going to last. And they assumed that it would last, that the line would hold. It was a great shock to them when the line didn't hold. But so it's fascinating to me how even in the midst of stress, the mundane takes over after a while. So when they first get to France, they're incredibly shocked and horrified by the indicia of war. Their first air raid in Paris freaks all of them out. But once they've been living in the front a little while, it's, you stick your earplugs in, and yes, you're being shelled again, but you've been shelled before and nothing's happened, or there's an air battle overhead. We've seen the air battles before, and you kind of hope it's not one of your aviator buddies who's up there and that everyone's okay. But it's only at odd moments that the war intrudes in a really serious way, if that makes any sense. They're mostly dealing with the aftermath of war. They're dealing with things that have already happened, but they're fixing them. And so to me, it was also really interesting to me what upset them and what didn't. Because there were things they took totally for granted, that horrible things happened in war. They all had excellent classical educations. They had read about the sacks of cities.
Sure.
And so a lot of this, they the fact that women were raped and that they were dealing with a lot of Bosch babies, babies who were the offspring of German soldiers. Bosch babies, they took totally for granted. I mean, none of this shocked them. Where they did, there was one thing where, and this was one of the things I had to hunt down, where I first read the publicly available sources, of which there are not many. And then I got my hands on their private letters, which filled in a lot of gaps for me.
Yeah.
But one of the things I stumbled on in the public sources was a woman talking about seeing something so horrible, it changed her whole view on life. And it made her decide to accept the proposal of the man who had been proposing to her for years and go home. And I was like, what's a terrible thing? And my college roommate and I spent hours on the phone speculating about the terrible thing. And she's like, it must have been rape. I'm like, no, but they are totally pragmatic and blunt about rape. They're also pragmatic and blunt about prostitution. There's a lot of casual prostitution going on because women need to find some way to feed their, their existing children. Actually, one of them made a comment. It was just so it was so classic about how she pointed out gently to this woman that in feeding Paul, she might be creating a little Pauline and thus doubling her problem. And maybe they should help her, start a rug industry or something instead.
Sure.
But they weren't shocked by this. They weren't judgmental. It was just stuff that happens in war. And so I finally tracked down the really horrible thing in the woman's best friend's letters. And it turned out that what it was, and I use this in the book, was that while the Germans were occupying, one of them had handed a little boy a lit piece of explosive and watched while it blew up in the boy's hand. And there had been no reason for this. It was pure motiveless malignancy. And that was the sort of thing that got them, that really upset them. That sort of, this was not part of the German war effort. This was someone being deliberately cruel, and that deliberate and pointless cruelty that gutted them in the ways other things didn't.
Yeah, and it stands out all the more because you realize these women are saying horrible things, and then if something really pulls them up, I think it has so much more of an impact as a reader also, because you realize that you're also starting to become acclimatized to the idea that, there are bombs falling or there's a gun going and they're debating, which direction it's coming from. And it's a part of their everyday life. But when that event happens, it really is shocking.
Well, I think it's also that for them, they feel like they are there to fix things, and that most of this they feel they can fix. Like they can't fix the family members who have been lost, but they can get them into decent housing. They can get the kids into school again. They can sew cute curtains and put those on the windows of the schoolhouse. There's so much they feel they can do, but things like that they can't fix. They can't fix the little boy who's been maimed. For absolutely no reason. And that's where it's when they come up against these things that they can't understand and can't solve, that the reality of the war hits them in a way it otherwise doesn't.
Yeah.
I was speaking to a group a couple of weeks ago, and someone asked me if they experienced the same kind of PTSD that nurses did in World War I. And that question struck me because I realized I saw very little sign of that. If anything, it was the opposite, that these were women who felt like they were really doing something good and worthwhile. And what they were doing was positive, that even, when the Germans invade and so much of their work is destroyed, they know they're going to go back and they're going to do it again. And that what they did mattered and that they had to do it. And so I think that's why when they do hit things that they can't do anything about, it's so much harder.
Yeah, certainly. I'm really curious about your research process because we've talked quite a bit about these letters and kind of, the detail that you're able to find in them and, even going so far as to track down what this horrible thing was through another woman's letters. I suppose my first question is, when did you realize this is a full book and this is not just a really interesting research rabbit hole that you've stumbled across and gone down? And also, should you have realized that at the moment? Because it sounded like you might have been researching something completely different at the time.
Well, actually, the book I was researching, so, in addition to writing my own books, I co-write with two really good friends, Beatrice Williams and Karen White. And we wrote a book called All the Ways We Said Goodbye, which is set in France in World War I, World War II, and the 1960s. And, the way we work is we all research and plot the whole thing together before we each take our own part of the book and write it. So we were researching the World War I part of the book. And actually for that, we did a lot of research on occupied France in World War I. So a lot of the background for that in this book was stuff I had already researched for All the Ways We Said Goodbye. But one of the things we needed to know for that book, one of the random specific things, was whether a certain Christmas cake would have been available in Picardy in the winter of 1914 under the German occupation. So, these are the things that, readers will stalk you for years if you get the Pickard Christmas cake wrong. So you have to find the Pickard Christmas cake. And I fell down the Google rabbit hole, Googling, Picardy, Christmas, World War I. And instead of the cake, I got a up popped this memoir by a Smith alumna talking about throwing Christmas parties for French villagers in Picardy in 1917. And I was like, whoa, what are a bunch of Smithies doing dressing up as Father Christmas right behind the front lines? This is bonkers. And so, of course, I dropped everything and I read the whole memoir because I was like, real. This is fiction, but it wasn't fiction. And then as soon as I read the memoir and the story in the memoir, and I don't want to just the memoir. Actually, the woman's great niece came to one of my events. I was like, thank you, you're great aunt. But you know how memoirs are. It was very guarded. There was a lot that was very deliberately not said, but it did provide the bare bones of the story and some rather colorful detail. It totally, I mean, it cracked me up because the only mention of any of sort of the internecine squabbles was she had this line at the beginning. The only barrier to that high endeavor were the limits of our characters and our fellowship. I was like, ooh, drama, drama, drama. But that was the only mention.
High and mighty, but also interesting in what it's not saying.
Well, it's also like it was like she had to admit somehow that not everything had been okay. But that was all she was going to say about it. And then after that, it's all, and we worked together and we did this stuff. And let me talk about these adorable French villagers who we helped. And, but it was like she had to get that out, but she couldn't actually say it straight out. So it's there, that little code phrase, like, not everything was okay over there. And it turned out actually things were even less okay than she admitted.
Sure.
Because among other things, there is also a guarded mention to the fact that their director, their founder, the woman whose brainchild this whole thing was, leaves 2 weeks after they get to their headquarters. And there's no explanation for it. I was like, okay, another red flag here. Mm-hmm. But, so I read that memoir. I was like, this is incredible and crazy. And how have I not heard of these women before? And so I started looking because I figured someone had to have written about these women. There had to be a monograph somewhere. And there wasn't. There was basically nothing. There were, mentions of them in books about women who went overseas in World War I. And it turns out there's a Smith professor who's writing a book about them right now, which will probably come out, 5 years from now. But as academia. Yeah. But, there was almost nothing. And that's when I called my agent. It was like, so I found these Smithies in the Somme. And I think there's really a story here because the arc of what happened to them, it was right there. It was a full and complete story as it was. And then, I threw myself on the mercy of Smith College Special Collection. Because they have a wonderful library guide where you can see which members of the unit left their papers in the archives and all that. I was like, so you have these people's papers. Wonderful. Is there any chance you could digitize some of these for me? Because, I have a 1-year-old, I can't make it to Northampton and, it would be amazing. And they're like, you realize that's like 2,000 pages. I was like,
yes, please.
Yeah. But I mean, and so the sheer quantity of material was incredible. And what made it even more amazing was not only that I had all these details about their events, the physical details, the way they lived, what they were experiencing, the mud, so much mud, what they ate, what they didn't eat, all of the stuff that you usually have to dig all over the place to find, it was right there. But on top of that, I had multiple people's perspectives on the same events, which was, it's like the jackpot. Where you're like, so you saw this way, but you saw this way. And you get such a, the whole kaleidoscope of an experience that way.
Yeah, it's absolutely fascinating getting to sort of dig in and get that real story behind it. You have a background in academia. Am I thinking that that's correct?
Yes, I am still ABD on my dissertation.
Okay.
A very, very, very long time ago, I was working on a PhD in Tudor Stuart England. Or early modern Europe, I think was the official description.
I was going to say, your research approach is so, in some ways, so academic, but then you're also finding these wonderful narratives and these stories and able to sort of build those things out. Do you think that having that academic grounding is helpful in that aspect, or does it also pull through to the actual writing of the book as well?
Well, I mean, having had the academic training is definitely helpful. In that, among other things, the best advice my advisor ever gave me was make friends with librarians. It was the first thing he told me when he gave me his little talk on how to do research. And that has served me well in my life because I have some wonderful, in particular, one wonderful librarian friend who, when I can't find things, she will track them down for me and find amazing things. I mean, being able to admit that you can't find things yourself, I think is one of the first things that's important to learn for a researcher. It taught me how to follow people's footnotes and dig for sources.
Mm,
But I think the things that made me leave academia are what make me a better historical fiction writer. And that's, I could never help imagining the what ifs.
yes.
That because of course, when you are doing academic history, what you're trying to do is put puzzle pieces together to figure out what happened and why it happened, and on top of that, why it's significant. But I would always start thinking about the empty spaces, and instead of wanting
Mm,
to deal with the puzzle pieces that were there, I would want to imagine the spaces between the pieces and what they might have been. And you can't really do that when you're writing academic history, not in the same way,
mhm.
because you need to footnote and you need to document. Whereas I think the art of historical fiction is often the art of taking scant sources and spinning together the pieces in between from the pieces we have.
Yeah,
It's the art
absolutely.
of it's the art of informed imagination.
I think that's a lovely way of putting it. It's taking that detail that you do have and being able to build out from there. And it's the moments you get to have a little bit of artistic license as well.
Well, and that was the weird thing about about writing Band of Sisters, was that I didn't have those gaps.
It sounds like
There
it.
were not gaps. It was all there. So, and that was its own challenge, because I'm so used to spinning in the spaces between the pieces of information we have. And in this case, I was trying to decide which bits to use and which bits to leave out. And I really had to fight for space for my characters to grow in that press of detail.
I imagine it can almost be overwhelming in some ways because there are so many wonderful details, so many wonderful stories, so many directions that you could go in if you have all these different perspectives. To really be disciplined about that, it must be in some ways heartbreaking. It's almost like having, stories that are on the cutting room floor if we're talking about film.
And at one point, I complained to a friend of mine that I felt like what I was trying to do was to take something that ought to be a TV miniseries that was basically World War I called The Midwife, and instead push it into a novel. That what it wanted was to have multiple mini arcs about multiple different viewpoint characters, but because of the form and the nature of the novel,
Mm.
I had to push it into a single arc, and it did not want that.
That's a great point, but maybe in the future there will be a mini arcs in a Netflix series or something like
Who
that.
knows?
You never know.
Cross
Fingers
fingers,
crossed.
knock on wood. I would so love that, because I feel like there were so many that it did have that call the midwife quality, where there are so many where you sort of feel like you could shine the spotlight on different characters at different times, and they each have their own story going on and their own drama underneath, sort of under the rubric of this one experience they're all sharing. But it's such different experiences for each of them, even though they're all there together.
Absolutely. It's a fascinating idea. We do have a question about on the ground research. Marjorie asks, have you been to France to do research, and where else have you traveled for your books?
Um, I break up my life into sort of BK and AK, before kids and after kids.
Yep.
So before kids, I actually did a lot of on the ground research in France. For about a decade, I wrote a series about spies during the Napoleonic Wars, the Pink Carnation series, and a number of those books were set in France. And so I have very fond memories of spending a fair bit of time over there for my, oh gosh, which numbers were they? Seventh and eighth books, I think, in the Pink
Mm.
series, which were both set in France. I actually wandered into a police station by accident. So I was looking for the museum of the prefecture of police for some very specific stuff I needed for the eighth book in the Pink series, the Orchid Affair. And so I'm like circling the block again and again because I had the address, and I just couldn't make sense of the fact that I couldn't find this building. And there was a police station there, and there are all these police cars, and the police start giving me weird looks as I circle it. And then I realized that actually, and I was jet lagged, I had just gone off the plane. The museum was in the police station. So I wander in, well, someone's being booked, someone's visiting a prisoner. I'm like, le musée de la préfecture de police, or whatever it was. And they told me, troisième étage. And in my befuddled jet lag state, I totally forgot that they count floors differently there. So I walked up to what would be our third floor, opened the door, and start walking down the hallway, and all these people converge on me and are like, you can't be here. I'm like, I'm just American and jet lagged.
So sorry.
I
I'm
just
so
want to
sorry.
find the museum. I'm writing a book. And they're like, oh, you are harmless. And they escorted me up the extra flight of stairs to the Museum of the Prefecture of Police, which is like randomly on the fourth floor of the police station or whichever floor it was. But I mean, it's a great little museum. Highly recommend it. But do remember, floors are counted differently there. But
It,
anyway, so yeah, I used to. So I spent a lot of time in France. I spent a lot of time in England. Ironically, the places I would most have liked to travel for my books are the places I generally didn't get to go. I wrote a book set in India,
Mhm.
but it was monsoon season and I was under back-to-back deadlines, so I never made it over there for that one. Um, I also wrote books on Barbados, and ironically enough, I did research for there like a decade ago, when I first came up with the idea before kids. And then when I finally got the green light on my Barbados book from an editor, I was pregnant with my second kid and there was Zika. So I could not take the tax deductible trip to Barbados. So that was very distressing. So I had to go back to my old notes from when I actually had spent the time at the Barbados Museum and Historical Society and try to reconstruct what I'd been looking at them.
that from 10 years ago, that would be quite the challenge.
It was, but part of what deterred me from risking it was that I got the worst mosquito bites of my life while I was researching at the Barbados
Oh,
Historical
sure.
Society, because it's partially open air and oh my God, those are vicious mosquitoes. So I was like, oh God, Zika, I remember those mosquito bites. I am not risking this.
Yeah, I can understand that, certainly. Absolutely. Oh, well, I think that is a good set of travel stories for your novels. And I actually did the story about the police precinct, did that make it into the Orchid of
Memory,
Hair?
it
Yeah,
did.
that
Yeah.
struck a familiar
Well,
bell.
because once that happened to me, I decided I had to use it. And it was so appropriate for, the Pink Books have a modern frame character, Eloise, who is always doing the same sort of slightly stupid things I do. And so I decided once I wandered into the police station by accident, Eloise had to do the same thing.
Of course. Well, and it sort of it's an interesting thread because although World War II and French Revolutionary spies may not seem like the most obvious connection, I think one of the strong themes that I always associate with your books is no matter how difficult sometimes the material can be, there's always a sense of humor that runs throughout them. And there were moments in Band of Sisters where I did actually laugh out loud, and my brother-in-law, who's also my assistant and watching right now, kind of popped up and was like, what are you reading for Ask an Author right now? What's going on?
Um,
Um, because there is humor, I think, and that's very human, right? To be able to find kind of even in moments of distress, some moment of levity.
and one of the things I adored about the Smithies and that made me feel such a deep kinship of them was that they had that sort of gallows humor. Their letters were filled with these snarky comments. And one of my favorites, which I paraphrased for one of my fake letters in the book, was one wrote home that they had been throwing Christmas party after Christmas party for these villagers. They were exhausted. And she writes home that the good thing is that Christmas comes only once a year, even in the psalm where bad things happen all the time. And it was just turns of phrase like that they were doing constantly. They were constantly mocking themselves and sending up their own mistakes. And I like to compare it to, for anyone else who's an Anne of Green Gables fan, to Rilla of Ingleside, because it's that same tone and that same humor. It's that delight in the absurdities of daily existence. And the funny thing is, I'm working on an 1890s book now, and the 1890s, I am not finding the same delight in the absurdities of
Hmm.
existence. I think it's very much of that particular generation and that era. And it's the snarky sense of humor that then reaches full bloom and almost caricature a decade later in the 1920s. That we associate with the madcap humor of Nancy
Yeah.
Mitford and Evelyn Waugh. And I'm trying to think who their American equivalents were. I'm drawing a blank, but what I mean. It's that 1920s blase snark. And
Mm.
the seeds of that 1920s blase snark were there in more earnest, less blase form in this prior generation.
That's really interesting. I would not have made that connection, but that makes total sense that it kind of
Neither would
becomes
I
a
until
reaction.
I read their letters. I hadn't really thought of it. And of course, Anne and Rilla are just Anne and Rilla. But you're reading this, I realized how much that book is situated in its generation and how much these women were part of that same generation.
Mhm.
And that this was how they saw the world. It was that combination of incredible earnestness and desire for service and a touch of madcap humor and very self deprecating humor. And I think what happens is after the war, the earnestness gets torn away,
Yeah.
and you get that kind of humor but without the earnestness that underpinned it, and that's where you get the sort of the dark cynical humor of the Mitford generation.
Sure. Yeah, I can definitely understand that being the roots there. That's fascinating. I would not have thought of that. I would love to ask you a little bit about what you're reading, if you have time to be reading while you're also promoting and writing and all the other things that you're doing as well. So is there anything that you've read recently that you've been recommending?
Sure. Well, the funny thing is, well, I can't work without reading. I need, I need reading like I need air. So I have to be immersed in someone else's book at all times. The weird thing about the pandemic was it meant I couldn't read most of the things I usually love reading. I am not sure why this is, but pandemic brain changed my reading habits. I'm curious to see if now things are getting slightly back to normal, if I'll go back to what I used to read. But for a long time last spring, all I could read were British mid-century mystery novels. I went tearing through, I don't know if anyone will have heard of her, Patricia Wentworth's Miss Silver series. She's sort of the poor man's Agatha Christie. It's sort of a similar era. She has an omniscient spinster knitting detective. And
Sounds
I
very
adored.
familiar.
Yes, exactly. Except Miss Silver is even more omniscient than Miss Marple, and that she's an official private detective. She was first a
Oh,
governess, but then discovered this talent for detection, and now she has a private inquiry agency. And
hmm.
there are like 50 books in the Miss Silver series, and you know that no matter what happens, no matter how out of whack the world is or how dreadful the crime, Miss Silver will solve it, and the young side couple will be together in the end. And it's
Oh,
just
good.
so deeply reassuring at a time when the world was turned upside down. It's like, but I'm at the vicarage with Miss Silver and there are stones and she will finish knitting those baby booties. So I read a lot of Miss Silver. I also read a lot of Mary Robert Reinhardt. She's considered the American Agatha Christie. And the funny thing was, I had read one of her books on a recommendation from a friend before the pandemic and bounced off it hard. They're very mannered, they're very dated. Apparently, when people make fun of the had I but known school of heroines, what they are actually referring to is Mary Roberts Reinhardt, who coined the phrase. But suddenly, with the pandemic, Mary Roberts Reinhardt went from kind of mannered and vaguely annoying to the sort of thing I needed because I knew how the plot was going to unfold. It's very predictable. And anyway, so I read a lot of Miss Silver and Mary Roberts Reinhardt. And right now, my current version of that is I am reading my way through Peters' medieval Cadfile mysteries.
I love those books. I grew up reading those when I was old enough to be reading those. And there's a wonderful PBS series that, of course, was produced, well, I'm sure it was BBC, but it was produced at the same time. Those books are fantastic.
The funny thing is, I grew up on the Derek
Eric
Jacobi or
Jacobi.
Derek Jacobi?
I
I'm
think it's
never
Jacobi,
sure.
but living in the UK after
Two
having
worlds.
been in America, I don't know what I'm saying most of the time.
That's a problem with the transatlantic existence is you're never sure which pronunciation you're using.
Exactly.
But yeah, so I grew up with the Derek Jacobi BBC Cadfile series, and I think I had tried to read the books back when I was in upper school, and at the
Mm.
time I loved Amelia Peabody, Elizabeth Peters mysteries, and I expected a high snark quotient in my reading material. And
Okay.
those books, they're very straightforward. And so I remember thinking they were boring at the time and I bounced off them. I viewed them really as fodder for the TV show. And having come back to them now, 20 years later, I am adoring them. I had never realized how quietly well done they are.
They're very gentle in a way, but also very intelligent, I think. And I love his fascination with, herbs and gardening and all of those things that kind of always somehow come together to be useful for solving the mystery.
I love, I know Alice Peters was a woman, which may account for it. I love how strong the women in these books
Mm.
are. I mean, yes, Cadfile is the gently omniscient detective, but the women in his books, in these books are no slouches. They are strong heroines and sensible people in their own right, which I find is often very rare in mystery novels.
Mhm. That's a wonderful recommendation. I may have to go back and I haven't heard of Marjorie. I'm sorry, the second author
Right.
that you
Oh,
recommended,
Mary Roberts Reinhardt.
Mary
I
Roberts.
feel like so Miss Silver I will recommend unreservedly, although there are
Yes.
good Miss Silvers and bad Miss Silvers. They're like the really fun Miss Silvers, and then there are the Miss Silvers where you're like, you did what? Were you under contract and late with the book? You know, but But with the Mary Roberts Reinhardts, they're among those books that I think have to come with these are a product of their time warning. There is a fair bit of casual racism,
Yeah.
certainly a lot of classism. There are many problematic elements in them, and they are fascinating as time capsules, but they're also problematic because they're time capsules, if that makes any sense.
Sure. Enter with the knowledge that not everything is acceptable.
Exactly, and
Yeah.
that they are very much a reflection of their time, but that the elements of the time represented in them are not always things that we would admire now.
Understood. Understood. I would love to ask you a little bit more about your next project, if you're able to share any details with us, with the stage you're at.
Sure. Well, I am working on a prequel to Band of Sisters. I mean, when I say prequel, it's not like you have to read it first or anything. It is only very loosely connected. But I became really fascinated with the founder of the Smith College Relief Unit while I was writing Band of Sisters, because she was a controversial and really larger than life character. The real woman had been a Smith grad in the 1890s and gone off to the American School of Classical Studies in Athens, determined to become an archaeologist,
Hmm.
and was told that women don't dig. That, if she wanted to, she could be a classics librarian. And she was like, no, 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 you do not understand. I am here to dig things up. But while she was there fighting for her right to dig, the Greco-Turkish War broke out. And despite failing her Red Cross training class, she pulled strings because she had made friends in the upper echelons of Greek society, because she is the sort of woman to whom those sorts of things happened.
Yes.
She pulled strings with the queen herself and got herself sent off to the front, where she turned out to have this genius for, organization and, if not necessarily practical nursing. And then, that's all very fascinating in itself. But what really caught me was that then, so a year later, she winds up going back to Greece, funds her own expedition, digs up part of Crete, and makes these incredibly famous discoveries. She's a monument in the field, wherever. But in that gap, she left Greece. She went back to the States and winds up nursing in the Spanish-American War. I was like, whoa, what just happened there? Why did she do that? This makes no sense. And so while I was writing Band of Sisters, my fictional version of this woman started dropping hints to me. Because, every now and then a character in a book, a side character will be like, hi, I've got a
I'm
story
really
for
interesting.
you. Yeah, come talk to me. Come talk to me. I've got stuff to tell you. And so that's what happened with this character, where she started dropping these enigmatic hints to me about her past. And I realized that not necessarily and I don't want to impugn the real woman. I have now moved away from the real woman, but that my version of her, something happened there in the Greco-Turkish War that tore her world apart and made her go redeem herself in the jungles of Cuba, and turned her into the person who would then later form the Smith College Relief Unit. But so that's the book I'm writing right now. It's a sort of young woman's journey of discovery in 1896 and 1897 Greece and 1898 Cuba.
This sounds absolutely fascinating. I am very excited for this, and I can see that people watching this are as well. So wonderful. Well, if people want to make sure that they stay on top of all of your new books and any news that you have, where can they find you online? What's the best way to follow your?
Well, you can always find me at my website, www.laurenwillig.com. I have a news page. Back in the day, we were all supposed to have blogs, but I couldn't quite bring
Yes.
myself to blog. So my compromise was I have an interactive news page where I post everything from, like, I have a weekly reading roundup where every week I post what I've been reading and people share what they've been reading. From that to, like, hey guys, here's when the new book's coming out. So it's a mix of sort of news, random thoughts, and other stuff. So come by, check my news page. There's also a contact form if you want to reach me. I also spend a lot of time hanging out on my Facebook author page, which is just Facebook/Lauren Willig, and on Instagram at Lauren Willig. I am technically on Twitter, but I have never figured out how to actually use it. So if you contact me there, you will hear from me roughly a year and a half from now, where I'm like, oh, maybe I should check Twitter.
I like it. That's, people are warned, and now they know. So Facebook, your website, this has been absolutely wonderful. Thank you so much for joining us and a really fascinating discussion. And I hope that everybody will, I can see already in the comments that everybody who hasn't purchased it already is very excited and running out and grabbing it. So thank you so much. And good luck with the rest of the book launch.
Thank you. And I am so looking forward to your next book too.
Thank you very much. Bye, everybody.
Bye, everyone.